All right, what's up, everybody? Students, strangers, and anyone in between. We are on a boat in the good old sunshine of May. It has finally stopped raining, so we are outside. Life is good. I'm not wearing a life jacket, even though I am in a boat, because I am tied to shore and I'm literally next to the sea. So mostly because I didn't want to drift away too far, but I am now drifting into some plants, so that's slightly annoying. All right, we are looking at the 1980s, where America becomes the top gun. So instead of doing my normal videos this week, I thought I'd try something a little different. So students, let's explore a bunch of different resources on this to cover these topics. So my students are following along with this sheet out there. We're going to be looking at it in class on the day that we cover it. Not quite sure what day that is, depending on the class you're in. So, all the 1980s, at least politically, and we can frame all these other changes that are happening in this time around Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan runs for president in 76, loses, but then he does win in 1980 as well as 1984. So we get this guy, good old Ronald Reagan here. And as president, wore suits a lot. I was just looking through this. There's a great article down here, which did Ronald Reagan always wear a jacket in the Oval Office? Spoiler alert, he did not. He sometimes just had a button down and a tie on. But Ronald Reagan is a conservative president. So he's part of that, which the last homework video talked about, the new right. So really, in his campaigns, talks about cutting taxes, cutting down on big government, and restoring a lot of Christian values to America. He uses the Roe v. Wade decision as a rallying cry around this idea of the loss of morals in America, and it really works. So Reagan becomes one of the most influential presidents in the last 50 years, and a lot of conservative Republicans now still see him as really their icon. So while he is in office, certainly a lot goes on. And one of the first things is when his focus on the economy. And we'll get back to that question, my students, on why Top Gun at the end. So one of the big things that Reagan does is cut taxes. Now, one of the reasons he cuts taxes is because of a belief that, number one, when you cut taxes, businesses then will use those tax cuts to invest in the businesses and workers themselves. So there's a lot of debate around the effectiveness of this. It's called trickle-down economics. We'll get back to this in a second. But most folks are under the belief that trickle-down economics does not, in fact, work. Just some evidence of such. This is a website called faireconomy.org. And it does not lead to economic growth. So if you look on this graph here, when we get into the Reagan years, the growth of the government does not increase. So you're not increasing the productiveness of the country just because you're cutting taxes. It doesn't lead to income growth. So there's the belief that companies will pay their workers more if they have tax cuts. That statistically is not true, which also does not lead to wages themselves growing, and it does not lead to job creation. So just because companies are saving money off of not paying more taxes, they aren't actually making more jobs. And certainly there are some positives from the tax cuts. There is an economic recession in the 1980s, and one of the solutions, or one of the reasons it disappears, is because consumers have more money in their pockets, and they end up spending more, which helps businesses make more money, which cuts down on unemployment. So certainly, while some tax cuts can have impacts in the short run, which are positive, it seems that the trends show that in the negatives, or those positives, don't last that long. So I'm going to use this as we keep going here. So this whole piece is called Reaganomics. So Reaganomics is really the all these economic policies, which today would be considered conservative economic policies, that Reagan puts into place during his presidency. Also, during his presidency, the Supreme Court has a massive change. So going into his campaigns, Reagan was talking about one of his big points is trying to get rid of Roe v. Wade. So he puts in a lot of justices who would be considered conservative, and one of them resulted in a topic which is going on right now that everyone will be watching as the election continues, which is Joe Biden is running for president, and he was involved in what was the confirmation hearing for Clarence Thomas. So Clarence Thomas was going to be the first African-American man on the Supreme Court, but he is accused by a woman who he had worked with, Anita Hill, of sexual advancements on her, and really just sexual misconduct. So during the hearings, Joe Biden's one of the senators questioning her, and really the vibe of the senators at the time were really not to believe her, that they thought she was just out to try to ruin someone's life, and that she was perhaps making up these stories themselves. So certainly very different in many ways from how our society might see it, but you could draw some parallels in some ways to the Brett Kavanaugh hearings, as this article does mention here from the Washington Post. However, the Supreme Court justices do take a much more conservative lean on things, which for many people is a good change in our Supreme Court. There was a lot of very liberal Supreme Court case decisions for a while there in the middle of the 20th century, and these decisions start to change. So there's decisions that limit the effects of the civil rights movement. There's decisions that try to, and in many ways, attack the decisions from Roe v. Wade, which in some cases, just to give you a bit of a timeline of some things that do occur for Roe v. Wade, is that, I'll scroll down here for this nice little timeline, which was passed in 1973. But one of the big cases with this new Supreme Court that is appointed by Ronald Reagan is they start to limit some abilities of abortions to be performed in certain states. So Missouri banned the use of public employees and facilities for abortions, and the Supreme Court upheld that. And that started a trend where in the federal Supreme Court has upheld some limits to abortions. So we got Supreme Court decisions. Deregulation is another piece that Reagan really focuses on, of allowing businesses to operate with much less oversight from the U.S. government. And there certainly are some benefits for that, of businesses really being able to focus on making money. So Reagan really is trying to help the economy improve and really challenge the Soviet Union, because remember, that's this big specter that's kind of floating above everyone. But so during the Reagan years, there are a lot of positive trends when it comes to economics. Unemployment drops. If you look at these three graphs right here, where Reagan's presidency is these dark shaded in the middle. So we have an increase in household income, which is great. Defense spending. So we certainly have the Cold War going on. But defense spending does increase under Reagan. So that does start this trend of spending, because he does cut taxes. So we have deficit spending, which can increase the national debt, but unemployment does go down. So there are some definite positives from the Reagan policies on the economy. Some economics experts really, though, have some critiques when it comes to healthcare. So after 1980, the government really changes how healthcare is regulated in the United States, and especially how much people pay for healthcare. So the healthcare costs have gone up greatly since 1980, which I guess the bummer in that case, this is a New York Times article looking at back in 1980, the U.S. was kind of middle of the pack when it came to life expectancy for the top about 25 countries. If you look down here, includes Japan, Sweden, Norway, a bunch of countries, Iceland, Ireland. And yet after 1980, our life expectancy has not increased, not nearly as much as these top countries in the world. And some point to this idea that at the same time that that's happening, the healthcare spending that individuals in America is increasing dramatically compared to all these other countries. So people are really spending a ton of money on their healthcare, which then limits the amount of people that can afford healthcare. And the belief is that that has dropped the overall health of the country. So, and to this day, certainly the healthcare is one of the biggest topics when it comes to the upcoming election. So the economic policies of Reagan when it comes to both businesses as well as larger industries, such as healthcare, had certainly a lot of impacts on the U.S. economy, both positive and negative. The AIDS crisis, it arises during the 1980s, and at the time, right when AIDS starts to be in the national lexicon, certainly now it's common, but there was a time where there was not AIDS. So there was a lot of fear. I get a helicopter flying behind me. What's up, helicopter? Okay. About what caused AIDS, and initially it was seen as the gay disease. So there was a lot of government efforts. This is a Smithsonian site that has a lot of these interesting posters that's really promoting safe sex. This is when a lot of the safe sex education happens in the United States. And especially in this poster, looking at how do you talk to kids about AIDS. There are 36 million people today with AIDS. About 1.2 million Americans have AIDS. But at the time, Americans were super scared. They're super confused, and it really hurt what was emerging gay rights movement in the early 1980s because there was then so much fear and stigma against gay people because this disease was associated with them. Certainly, it's now become associated with drug use, especially with unclean needles. But Americans were quite terrified, and to this day, it is still a global epidemic. Racially, certainly in the 1960s, we had the Civil Rights Movement, so continuing African Americans like Jesse Jackson. Actually, he runs for president twice. He does not win, but he does run. So African Americans in prominent positions are increasing. Certainly, while there was scandal around Clarence Thomas, we also do have a Supreme Court justice who is an African American man. In other communities, we have Native Americans continuing their struggle, which they have continued virtually all of the history of the United States. The Latino movement, we have a huge increase in Asian American immigrants, which actually comes to a head in the cities. So while there are positive gains, the cities is really where everyone who lives there is really kind of falling behind. There's this white flight that's been happening for decades now, so there's what's known as urban decay. And the cities really, in some cases, are burning down. They're violent. This is a graph of rising crime. It is a rising crime. So if you look here in the 1980s, there's a massive spike in violent crime. And today, I mean, much, much smaller. So the cities are really dangerous places where there's a lot of homelessness, economic disparities, and it really is hurting the perception of the government in many groups of people, and particularly government agents. In 1992, in 1991, a man named Rodney King is beaten by the police, and it's caught on camera. And the videotapes of this beating, where he's really laying on the ground while a group of white police officers beat him in LA, which is a deeply segregated city. All the police officers who are pictured here are acquitted. So this leads to, in 1992, which leads to riots throughout LA. There are light-skinned people who are in cars that are pulled out of their cars and beaten up. In some cases, some African Americans, like in this case, rescue a white truck driver who's pulled out of his truck and almost beaten to death. So the riots go on and on. There's a lot of looting going on in the cities. Cars are being burned. And if you look at this photograph here, at the same time, a Korean American shop owner had shot a 15-year-old black girl in a neighborhood in Los Angeles. So a lot of Korean American establishments are targeted. It turned out later she was holding the money to pay for the drink, which he had shot her for attempted, what he claimed, stealing, and he was also let off on probation and a $500 fine. So there's a lot of tensions, especially in the cities, due to race as well as poverty. I guess I didn't have that slide or that slide. The last thing is I meant to type in here, the Cold War. So Ronald Reagan oversees really the demise of the Soviet Union, as with policies that he implements, but really the fall of the Soviet Union comes from within. So we have Mikhail Gorbachev, who is the Soviet premier, and he starts to implement a number of policies, namely the two most famous ones, perestroika, as well as glasnost. Perestroika looks at reforming the economy, which this nice little informational guide from the state of Washington it has. And it's really trying to introduce elements of a market economy, whereas before it was entirely communist. So there weren't any Western businesses, there was no McDonald's, all these other things. And glasnost was an attempt to, and it was, I guess, successful, open up the censorship in the Soviet Union. So before it was tightly controlled what people could read and see and hear. And so he opened up a lot of these reforms. And that coincided with people in Soviet states, namely, if you look on this map, these more Western Soviet states. There's uprisings where people are really tired of communism. They want more freedom, namely economic freedom. So combined with Reagan really putting the pressure on the Soviet Union to give up control in certain areas, as well as increase some spending in militaries, whereas the Soviets cannot keep up. It does result in the fall of the Soviet Union. So by the time the 1990s come, the United States is the top gun on the planet. Not only that, they are winning at the Olympics, so the sports athletes of the United States are truly superior to most other countries in the world. And it's really one of these places that Americans really feel proud of themselves, of what they have become. So the spirit of becoming the best is truly throughout the 1980s, which is why our slides are called Top Gun. But I guess the interesting thing, which is a bit explains this. Remember, the United States had come from all of this turmoil in the 1960s. In the movie Top Gun, if you've seen it, we have this fighter pilot who's struggling. His father gets killed in Vietnam. So there's this feeling of they're trying to move past this really dark time where there is all these struggles. And certainly there is a lot of economic prosperity, and many groups are benefiting in the 1980s. But it is important to remember that there are some groups that truly keep suffering. And in many cases, I'd say the urban population still has many problems, certainly not to the extent of the 1980s. But we are still seeing some of these things today. So hopefully you enjoyed this new video. I'll check in with all y'all in my class. But if you aren't in my class, let me know how you think this one turned out. And catch you later. Go outside, have some fun, and enjoy.